Actually got a master's in education and is now a public school teacher in Hawaii. And her youngest daughter is still in college. But Dorothy paid a really steep price for her choices. And for years, she worked a series of hospital billing jobs in Northern California. She earned as much as $22 an hour in the 90s. And that mostly paid her bills, but not always. And she was sort of selective about which bills she would pay when she could. She worked cocktail waitressing jobs on weekends to come up with extra money to send her daughters to science camp, to buy one of them a cheerleader outfit so she'd fit in with her classmates. But she fell behind. And one day in late 2006, a cop pulled her over. She was driving through San Jose. And he noticed that she had an expired registration sticker. This was a $10 sticker on her car. She'd failed to pay it, and then she failed to pay a previous ticket for being stopped similarly, and the officer had her car towed away. And she didn't have the money to get her car out of the lot. The fines built and built until it became over $1,000. Without a car, she couldn't get to her job. Without her wages, she couldn't pay her rent, and so she moved out of the house she'd been living in for more than a decade, where she'd raised her daughters. And she moved in with a friend to a part of Oakland on a street they came to call Crack Avenue, in a very dilapidated house with a lot of vagrants milling about. And they didn't realize that their landlord wasn't paying his bills until the foreclosure notice came in the mail. And even as their water and electricity were cut off for lack of payment. And by the middle of 2008, Dorothy Thomas, this mother of two girls who made it to college, was living in a homeless shelter. Well, when I first met Dorothy, it was at a job center in downtown Oakland. And she was growing really depressed. She was sending out resumes, but the unemployment rate at this point was soaring. At this point, even healthy companies couldn't borrow money, and they were laying off workers out of fear that they would lose access to capital. The financial crisis had truly become an economy-wide event. This wasn't just a Wall Street thing. And Dorothy was having to figure out, how do I justify even paying the public transportation that's required to get down to the job center to look at these job listings when I know that there's 6, 8, 10 applicants for these jobs that themselves aren't going to pay nearly enough for me to get myself to a decent apartment. How do I justify, bothering to find a way to shower when the water's been cut off at my house to get myself downtown to continue to look for a job? And she was starting to get worried that she might never work again. She nearly got one job, and then the employer checked her credit and discovered she had bad credit and turned her down. Now, what is the point of this story? I mean, Dorothy Thomas made terrible mistakes, and she'd be the first to tell you that. And in teasing apart the details of any individual financial disaster, it's easy to find decisions that should have been made differently at the time, bad judgment. But the real question is, how did we get to live in a country where there are so many Dorothy Thomases? How did so many people come to land in such financial distress that they were choosing from an array of all pretty fundamentally lousy economic choices? Well, part of how is that before this crisis, too many people were living in close proximity to catastrophe. I mean, before this recession, roughly half the country had liquid assets of $5,000 or less. If you think about that for a minute, that means that heading into what we now know is the longest, deepest recession since the Great Depression, half the country had so little money in the bank that one piece of unexpected bad news, an illness, a divorce, a lost job, was not simply bad news. It was going to be tough to stay off the street. And indeed, even people with means, even wealthy people, had come to rely on credit to such an unhealthy degree. All of this easy money, supposedly insured by these derivatives, was flowing through this economy that even people who presumably would know better got themselves in a world of hurt. This credit bubble was much more than an economic event. It saturated our culture, and it made work and budgeting come to seem almost like anachronistic pursuits for people who were too stupid to realize that they could sit in their bathrobes and buy NASDAQ stocks in the morning and sell them an hour later and make easy money, and then later, pick out the free money from their homes that was just waiting there if they were homeowners. Another major character in my book, a woman named Fran Barbaro, had a resume full of six-figure tech industry jobs and an MBA. Yet when I first met her in 2007, she was trying to spare her own home from foreclosure. She had used up her stock portfolio, which at one point had been worth nearly $1 million. She'd borrowed so much against her home in Boston that she could no longer make the payments. And she had spent the money as she recovered from surgeries. She would miss work and rely on her savings, but it seemed like her savings would just replenish themselves courtesy of the stock market. And she was paying for expensive after-school programs for her two sons who had learning disabilities, and for high-quality produce in places like Whole Foods. And she had simply never bothered to square her expenditures against her income because it had never seemed necessary. I mean, her house was this ATM machine that never required a deposit. And as she put it to me, the money was always there, not just for her, but for millions of other Americans. The cultural norms shifted. In the 90s, you would come home from a dinner party with these stock tips that you had to be a fool not to participate in. You could double your money in a couple of hours, and this expanded the parameters of what seemed like acceptable behavior. In fact, when I first started talking to Fran, she said, "Well, I didn't buy those silly .com stocks. I was buying solid companies that I could read their earnings statements. I could read about them in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times." Companies like Cisco Systems, which were selling all this stuff to the .coms that soon didn't exist and couldn't buy it anymore. Things that seemed conservative in those days, in retrospect, seemed crazy. But when this was what was happening in the culture, when you could come home from a dinner party with a seemingly surefire way to double your money in a few hours, how could you say no to a kid who needed special programs to learn how to read, when you had the money? Why would you not shop at Whole Foods and bring home quality food for your family when the money was just there for the taking? Moreover, living on borrowed money had become the organizing principle of American economic reality, and not just at the household level for people like Fran Barbaro and Dorothy Thomas, but at the Treasury, on Capitol Hill, and throughout commercial life. American society had come to depend upon the continued largesse of foreign creditors, not least China. We've been able to spend much more than we earn as a society because the American consumer has been the engine of economic growth, not only here, but around the world. There's a state of codependence that we have with much of the rest of the world. In essence, we save too little and we spend too much and we buy up Chinese-made goods, and that creates crucial jobs for Chinese factory workers in mostly coastal cities in China. And China takes our money and they send it back to us by buying up our mostly treasury bonds, our public debt. And that allows us to go back to the mall and spend some more. And it keeps interest rates relatively low because our treasury doesn't have to pay out a higher return to attract other investors. And that helps make housing prices go up. This flow of money from China has been a crucial means of allowing Americans to live far in excess of our incomes. But the world has now changed in crucial ways as a result of our crisis, and that really reinforces the imperative for us to figure out how to get ourselves out of this codependent relationship on our own terms. Confidence in our financial system has been shaken around the world. While we're still a place where many central banks park their national savings, and the dollar still seems fundamentally like a relatively safe investment, we're no longer the paragon that we seem to be before. And at the margins, we already see the People's Bank of China, for example, no longer buying up as much of our debt as they did before the crisis. In part, that reflects changes inside China. China is increasingly focusing on its own domestic needs. China may not be a democracy, but it has domestic political pressures much like any country, and it certainly hasn't escaped the notice of people in China that Chinese factory workers have been laboring hard to make stuff that gets sold here, and the